Okay, I think we will get started. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining today. We are going to spend the next 25 minutes or so looking at how we can make multilingual learning easier to plan, brief, and deliver. This session is really aimed at in-house learning and development teams who may already be managing localization or are looking at doing this in the near future. And the goal of today's session is really simple. I want to help you avoid some of the common pitfalls when it comes to translation that might slow projects down, increase costs, or cause unnecessary stress. So I want you to leave today feeling better equipped to handle these and to make your projects go a lot more smoothly. Just a quick introduction from me before we dive into today. I'm Emily and I look after client partnerships here at Comtech. I've been working in localization for just over 9 years now, mostly with e-learning agencies and in-house learning and development teams. So everything that we're going to be covering in today's session is very much based on real projects, real clients, and real challenges that I see day to day. I'm also a director on the board of the Learning Network, which is a UK-based community aimed at supporting professionals in the learning and development industry. And that gives me a really broad view on what's working and also what's not working in the industry. Also, very briefly about Comtech, for anybody who's not familiar with us already, we are a full service localization partner. We have over 40 years experience. I think we're actually coming up to 45 years this year, working across 250 different languages. We have a global network of over 4,000 linguists who support us in delivering all of these different languages, and that spans across so many different services as well, from straightforward translation to subtitling to voiceover. Because we really are a full service agency and partner. And also, we are a learning network industry partner on top of all that as well. So, everything that we're going to be talking about today really does come from a lot of hands on experience. So, what we will be talking about today, firstly, we will be looking at some of those key decisions that make multilingual projects run easier. And that will be right from the very start of the project. We'll then also look at how to put together a strong brief when you're talking to an e-learning agency or a localization partner who will be looking after your translation project. We will look at the age-old question of AI, where it can help and where it can sometimes hinder. And then we'll be looking at some practical ways that you can be reducing rework, be reducing that friction that happens during the review process, and also how to keep the learner experience completely consistent and smooth across all of your different markets. I will then wrap up today's session with some key takeaways and a special offer for anybody who's joining us live today or catching up online. So let's dive in. I think one of the biggest misconceptions that I see around translation is the thought or the understanding that localization is just a single box to tick within a project plan. But actually, it's very much a series of decisions. And it's when those decisions aren't made up front or fairly early in the process that can kind of manifest a little bit later down the line as issues, challenges, delays, frustrations. So it's things like who's reviewing each language? How are you managing feedback? Are you using AI? Are you using human? Or are you doing a combination of the two? How are you looking at handling video content? Is it just a transcript? Is it subtitles? Is it voiceover? Have you factored in time for whichever approach you want to take? All of these things early on, if they're not tackled, they can tend to snowball and kind of unravel during delivery. So it might just be one item on your list, a single box to tick in the plan, but in reality, it is a lot more kind of smaller, regular decisions that can impact how smooth your rollout is. So you might have guessed it that the key to good planning is actually good decision making. What we can often see is that that handful of early decisions made early on can prevent the majority of issues and challenges that crop up later on. For example, you'll see this is a common theme throughout today's session, but the review period, that review cycle is actually crucial in the success of your project. If you're able to identify key reviewers up front, they might be key in market contacts. They should always be native speakers wherever possible. If you can book them in advance, agree what that review period looks like. They should just be checking for things that are specific to your brand voice, specific to your terminology, rather than doing a full proofreading if at all possible, and how long each of those stages will last. Getting all that booked in up front will avoid things like the review cycles that never end, and also the impact that that can have to your delivery schedule. The second thing on the list is to be keeping track of your editable source files. You might be creating an image file that has text in it. You're obviously just dropping things like the JPEG or the PNG into the final build file if it's an e-learning course, for example. But you will need to keep hold of whatever the image has been created in, whether that's InDesign, Illustrator, because if you want that text to be translated, we're either going to have to create it from scratch or we're going to have to go into the editable file. So just keep a log of all of your editable files. That also goes for things like videos. If you're creating something in Premiere Pro or something similar, you don't just want the MP4 because you can't do anything with that at the end of the day. You need to make sure that you've got everything to hand and able to drop any localizations in. The third thing on the list is getting your markets to sign off the source content, or at least seeing it up front before it goes to translation. And this can sound a little bit kind of unusual, but actually, what happens a lot of the time when a market has feedback on translation, it's not necessarily anything to do with the quality of the translation that they're reviewing. It can sometimes be that they actually fundamentally disagree with the English source content, but having not seen it previously, they don't know that that's what their issue is. So giving them that chance to at least have advance notice of what the content is going to be saying and giving them an opportunity to highlight anything that might not work in their market up front is a really easy and early opportunity to get ahead of some of those localization challenges that might happen down the line. Fourthly, you want to be thinking about your AI approach as early as possible. You might want to go down a fully AI route. You might want a fully human route. You might want to kind of do a combination of the two. And sometimes actually doing a little bit of sampling or testing can help you decide on which approach is right for each market. Um, so getting that done, maybe even before your English content is fully signed off, just so that you're all fully comfortable, that will make sure then that you don't have any misalignment of expectations down the line. There's nobody who is expecting a certain service level or a certain quality of translation that's just not possible, which with whatever route you've decided to go down in terms of localization. And finally, get ahead of any LMS testing. What you don't want to happen is that for there to be a bug in your English content, if it's an e-learning module, for example, and then that is duplicated, triplicated, multiplied across 10, 15 different languages, and you end up having to make individual fixes in each of those different SCORM files, when you could have just tested it and fixed it in your English before it even goes to translation. So those would be some examples that I've seen in kind of recent projects over the last few years, of where an early decision or an early action could have actually got ahead of some of those challenges there. Next, we're going to look at why the timing of some of these decisions is almost as important as the decision that you're making yourself. So you can see here when localization is included quite late in the process, a lot of your content is locked down. There's no time to adapt any assets or any content. There's also no time for testing or reviewing. If you are able to kind of do it midway through the process, then that's better than nothing. It might mean that some content is locked down, some decisions have already been made. You might have a little bit more flexibility there. But obviously, the ideal is that you are considering localization either before the content has been written, or very much early in that process. It means that you can write your content with translation in mind. You can leave space for text expansion, for example. You can avoid any cultural references, and you have time to build things like review and testing into your timeline as well. So it kind of goes without saying that the earlier that you plan, the better that your rollout will be altogether. At the planning stage, I think there are Six key areas to think about. The first one is probably the most obvious, it goes without saying, but have a think about your languages and markets. Which languages do you want to translate into? Are there any priority languages there? And if so, have you got people in each of those markets to be reviewing and signing off the content? Secondly, think about the cultural fit of your content. Is there any examples of cultural references, for example, that might not translate more globally? Are there any visuals that might be potentially offensive or confusing to a different market? Is there humor or wordplay that might need a little bit of extra work when it comes to the localization approach? There's also things to consider from a production standpoint. If you are working with a custom font, for example, there'll be brands like IKEA or Lego who might have their own fonts that they want to see used in learning content, which is great because it aligns to that idea of brand identity, but it might not necessarily support characters in other languages. You've got things like Eastern European languages with the diacritics, the special symbols that might not be supported by custom fonts. Then you've got things like Arabic and Chinese and Hebrew, which are using completely different scripts, again, might not be supported by custom fonts. That's also something that you want to think about with custom components in any build work as well, any e-learning or technical work. Things like right to left languages might need a little bit of extra tweaking, or they might not work at all depending on what your setup is. So again, just have a think about kind of how to get around that. You might want to do some upfront testing. You might want to think about a backup plan, maybe a replacement font if those languages don't work. And if you do work with a translation partner, that might be the time to kind of loop them in and get their thoughts on how to approach something while everything's still in that planning or design phase. We touched on this a little bit already with number one, but for those for each language, who is going to be reviewing that? I think I've mentioned already they should ideally be native speakers. And have you built those review periods into your project plan as well? Typically, we try to advise 2 to 3 review periods within a project plan, especially if it's the first time you're working with a specific language or a specific market. You might want to build in a sample, maybe 500, 1,000 words, just to get some early feedback on how that language is going. You might also want to do a full linguistic review before you put any content back into its original format. For example, if you do have an e-learning course, maybe get that content approved, signed off before it goes back into Storyline or Evolve or whatever it might be that you're using. Um, Also, if you're recording voiceover, whether that's human voiceover or AI voiceover, again, working with an approved version of those translations will just help you minimize any updates or kind of manual edits that you have to make later down the line. So I would really recommend kind of building those review periods in, and then having just a final sign off at the end of the project for any kind of minor amends that might crop up in the later phases of the project. Have a think then about where you want to be using AI, if at all. Think about what the risks might be of getting it wrong, or if you haven't got anybody available to review the translations. Are those risks reputational? Are they cultural? Are they financial if you're working in compliance or something similar? And where do you maybe need more human input? And that could be support from an agency, it could be support from native speakers within your wider team, but just have a think about where it makes the most sense to be taking those risks and how you can safeguard those as much as you possibly can. And then look at your deliverables. What do you want the end result of your project to be? Do you want something like a language selector that makes it really easy for a learner to determine which language they want to use on your LMS? Are there specific SCORM requirements that you're going to need to tell your translation partner or your learning agency to publish in so that it can even work on your system? Again, things like that. The more that you can think about them up front and kind of build them into a brief, or that kind of that planning stage, it just all helps to make your translation process as smooth as possible. And as you can see here at the bottom of the screen, every attendee from today's session, if you've signed up or you're joining us live, will be sent a copy of our localization planning checklist, which will help you cover all of the decisions that I've just talked through. So we just touched on it then a little bit at the end of that last slide. But I think a real factor in making a translation project a success is how you can brief in your translation partner or agency if you're working with them. Obviously, it goes without saying that a better brief always leads to a better outcome. And your localization partner can only make good decisions if they understand the purpose, the learning objective, the audience, and the risks involved with your project. So, a strong brief should include things like what are you aiming to achieve with this learning course, this learning program, these assets that you're putting together, and who are the target audience? What are your languages, regions, and priority markets, as we've mentioned already? What are the source files or scope outline if you haven't built any content yet? What's the kind of rough expectations for what that content will look like? Do you have any guidance on tone or terminology or tone of voice that we should be consistent with? Are there any preferences or restrictions when it comes to using AI? What do you want those review stages to look like? And if you don't know, then that's when you can kind of get advice on that. Are there any technical requirements, for example, the SCORM publishing settings that I've just mentioned, and timelines? And I think that's probably one of the more crucial elements to include because often your launch date, your rollout plan, that can often inform a lot of the earlier decisions as well. It might be that actually, if you have a relatively short timeline, that might then inspire a need for AI to be able to generate your content in languages much more quickly. But without all of these details, you're likely to end up with a more sort of generic approach to localization rather than one that's kind of tailored to your specific needs. So we've talked about AI a little bit. It's obviously a huge topic across all industries, not just learning and development at the moment. But I think the key thing to remember here is that there's not one size fits all approach when it comes to AI in localization. We very much think of it in terms of a spectrum. And you've got, on the one hand, there on the left-hand side, a fully AI-driven solution. No linguists are involved. You've got a machine translation there that's been proofread by AI as well. Fully then through to the other side of the spectrum, which is full human translation from scratch, completely creative. There's been no element of technology or AI used there. But it isn't necessarily a kind of you pick one and that's your blanket approach for everything. It could be that certain languages need one approach, whereas others could benefit from something a little bit more human, for example, or it could be different types of content. For example, you might be happy to have things like an e-learning module and handout have a more AI-driven approach, but then things like voiceover scripts, or game content or anything like that might need a little bit of extra human input. So you have that complete flexibility to determine how much of a human input you want in your localization approach. But I think the most important question isn't should we use AI, but more where does it make sense to use it and then where doesn't it? I think I also just wanted to touch on quickly some of the tools that have got a built-in translation function. So I've mentioned things like articulate localization, for example, which can translate the courses without it ever actually leaving the authoring tool. And this might be a perfect solution for you. But I think it's important just to kind of consider some of the areas that need a little bit more support or thought before you kind of use this as your approach. So think about have you got approved terminology, tone, or style guidelines that you need to be consistent with? And is whatever tool you're using able to apply those and use those consistently? Is it able to reuse translations that you have seen across previous courses so that you've got that consistency there? Does it cover things like video, subtitles, PDFs, downloads, for example? A lot of the courses will only, or a lot of the tools will only grab content that's on the screen. So you might just want to think about an alternative solution for anything that's embedded in your course, for example. And again, who is reviewing that output and what are they checking against? Are they able to do a bilingual review within that tool, or is it a little bit more manual? And again, you might need some support in just working out the best way to do that human review stage. So I popped some helpful tips at the bottom of this slide that I think actually really help when you're working with an automated translation tool, like some of the ones built into authoring tools and LMSs. I think it's worth taking the time to build a glossary if your tool supports a glossary, because this can definitely help with the consistency of terminology. It will also be worth running a sample. It doesn't have to be big. Again, 500, 1,000 words is usually enough just to test the quality before you commit to any specific approach. And that includes human translation as well. And then, as I mentioned already, just thinking ahead for a plan B when it comes to embedded assets like images or video and how you might need to approach those if they're not picked up by your automated tool. Then we're going to look at how we can make that review period, that review process as smooth as possible. And I think that can often be one of the biggest pain points in a localization cycle. So, some of the issues that have come up in the past are things like reviewers rewriting based on personal preferences rather than checking for any objective errors. There might be disagreements across the markets. It might be that there is feedback that comes in late and actually then threatens to kind of cause knock-on delays for the rest of the project. Um, and all of this can kind of add to just general frustration and delays within the project. So, some of the ways that you can avoid some of these challenges that come up, again, identifying those reviewers and booking them in early. Agree what they're reviewing for. So, typically, my advice would be to steer them away from any preferential changes. Yes, translation is incredibly subjective. There are a million different ways to say things in every language, but just because it's not necessarily how you would say it doesn't make it objectively wrong. So, we want to make the use of everybody's time. So try to kind of prioritize what they should be reviewing. And typically that tends to be any brand specific terminology or anything that kind of really steers it away from a brand tone of voice. And again, if you can provide things like reference material up front, whether that is to an AI engine or to a translation partner, however you're approaching this, that should also help get ahead of some of the things that a reviewer would be looking for. Um, Also make sure that you're setting deadlines and being very vigilant about enforcing them, especially if you have a very tight deadline or a unmovable launch date, making sure that you're kind of limiting those review rounds to a very specific period and moving forward with the project if you need to, rather than letting things run on and on. And if you have got a review process and you're working with a translation partner or a glossary, is making sure that you're building feedback in so that it can be reused at a later date. And hopefully that will minimize any changes that happen then as the projects go on. And finally, we'd like to look at how we can keep that learner experience consistent across all of the markets. So, I mentioned already a glossary is really key to ensuring that consistency. You also want to make sure if you've got the particular style guidelines, if there's things that you want to leave in English, if there is a certain formality level that you want to be using, is putting that all in place so that you have those key guidelines for whether that's the AI or the human translation team that you are using. If you are using a translation partner, is making sure that they have the same translation team wherever possible in place for every project so that your content has that consistency, especially in terms of tone of voice over time. Using a translation memory if you're working with a translation partner, because this is a store of wording, of terminology, of style guidelines that can be reused across projects that will hopefully reduce that work that's needed to be done by your reviewers. Checking things like examples, cultural references, scenarios, visuals with your in-market colleagues before you go to build rather than afterwards, and making sure that you're capturing all of that reviewer feedback and that you're feeding it in ready for the next project. And I've said here, consistency isn't just about that final polish. It's actually a series of habits that happen all the way through the project, starting with the very beginning of that planning process to make sure that it's fed all the way through. So we're coming to the end of today's session, and I'll just wrap up with a few key takeaways from today's session to summarize. Firstly, you've hopefully grasped already, but the sooner that you can be planning localization at a project, the better. Those late decisions, they can mean a lot of rushed work, which could have an impact on quality. It could mean extra review rounds or extra costs, and it often puts launch dates at risk as well. Not all content needs the same treatment. So we've talked about AI a little bit. You can match your workflow, your content to different approaches. And again, if you work with a localization partner, they can help you with things like samples to make sure that you're comfortable with each approach before you move forward. AI is a tool, but it's certainly not the entire strategy. It shouldn't kind of replace anything. It should just be an additional tool that you are using. And often the greatest value comes from combining the efficiencies, whether that's cost or time of AI, with that linguistic expertise at the right time, at the right moments, but with very clear guardrails in place to manage that. And finally, it's you that shapes the outcome. So you might not necessarily be managing the linguists if you're working with an agency or a partner, but it's those decisions that you make early on that can really shape the timeline, the budget, and the learner experience. Just a little bit of information here as well on how Comtech can support you. We're always on hand to help with things like scoping and quote support, reviewing your content and making recommendations on the right approach. And that includes where and when to use AI as well. We are a full service agency, and that includes AI-led solutions, bringing in human review to support with AI or fully human-led solutions as well. Things like terminology and style guidance, so building linguistic resources that can support the localization process, managing your reviewers, multimedia localization like subtitling and voiceover, testing, and also building a localization process that works for you. Anybody who has joined us today live or is catching up online, there is a special offer for you there. If you scan that QR code, it will take you through to where you can send us a project outline, content list, or scope, and we will review it for you free of charge with absolutely no obligations there, where we can help you just get started on your localization journey. And also coming to your inbox following today's session, there are 4 practical guides to help you plan better for your localization projects. That includes a planning checklist, a project planner, a localization approach guide, and your 6 steps to localization success. So thank you very much, everybody who has joined us today. I hope that this has been useful and has given you a few practical ideas to take away. If anybody has any questions, my contact details are on screen for you there. And I hope very much to hear from you soon. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.